Push the compassionate angle, say Parkinson's. That's what my son-in-law whispered outside my door the night he thought I wasn't listening. In 8 words, he turned kindness into a weapon and my age into a strategy. I'd built a quiet life on proof, logs, cameras, receipts, never imagining I'd need them to defend my name from family. What began as help with paperwork became a plan to seize everything I'd worked for, wrapped in the language of love and safety. This is how a handshake soured into a courtroom, how a tremor became a script, and how the evidence I kept for routine ended up saving me when the people I trusted didn't. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I am Henry Caldwell, 70 years old and stubborn enough to keep a schedule that would make a rooster check his watch. Most mornings start at 5, with the kettle ticking on the stove and the dark shape of Blanco Ridge slowly surfacing outside my kitchen window. When the first light spills over the hill country, it carries the smell of mesquite smoke and dry cedar, as if the land itself remembers every barbecue we've ever burned. By 6, I'm out back in the rickhouse, walking the narrow aisles between stacked white oak barrels, tapping bungs with my knuckles and noting down temperature and humidity. Numbers settle me. They don't flatter or lie. In my logbook, wide-ruled, battered, corners curled from 100 thumbings. I track every shift the way I once tracked load and stress when bridges were my business. A photograph hangs by the mudroom door, Maggie at the Blanco County Fair, caught mid-laugh, sun in her hair, paper ribbon pinned crook to her dress. It holds the room steady when the wind comes through. Sometimes I touch the frame before I step outside, like a habit I picked up without noticing. Widowhood inches into a man rearranging furniture he thought was nailed down. Bourbon helped me find an honest rhythm after I retired. The patience of charred oak, the humility of time, the discipline of leaving well enough alone. My place sits at the edge of town, pasture sloping to a dry creek, tin roof that rings when rain finally remembers us. There's a flag on the porch because that's how I was raised, and a church bulletin under the salt shaker because Sunday is a compass that hasn't failed me yet. Pastor Wells preaches plain, and when he talks about keeping faith with small things, I think of barrel staves swelling to a seal, or hinges greased before they squeal. Sheriff Mason Tate fishes with me once a month out on Canyon Lake. He swears I cheat at dominoes. I say he bluffs at cards. We agree to call it even and pass the thermos. I live alone, but I'm not unaccompanied. Sensors ping softly when the barn door opens. A motion cam watches the side gate for stray dogs and stray teenagers. The doorbell is the good kind, the kind that records more than faces. I don't mind electronics, I just expect them to behave. Over a lifetime of supervising pours and checking rebar, you learn the difference between trust and wishful thinking. Believe the evidence, I tell the men at the veterans' breakfast when someone brings up gossip. Steel doesn't care how you feel about gravity. Emily, my only child, works events in Austin and drives down as often as her calendar allows. She breezes in with lists and labeled containers, lays a palm to my forehead like I'm still a feverish kid, and pads the freezer with soups that go farther than my pride will admit. She has Maggie's way of listening, head tilted, smile waiting until you're finished. Before she leaves, she'll stick a note on the bread box. "Eat lunch, Dad." I keep the notes for a while, then tuck them in a drawer with ticket stubs and old pocket knives that remember too much. Emily, my only child, works events in Austin and drives down as often as her calendar allows. She breezes in with lists and labeled containers, lays a palm to my forehead like I'm still a feverish kid, and pads the freezer with soups that go farther than my pride will admit. She has Maggie's way of listening, head tilted, smile waiting until you're finished. Before she leaves, she'll stick a note on the bread box. "Eat lunch, Dad." I keep the notes for a while, then tuck them in a drawer with ticket stubs and old pocket knives that remember too much. Her husband Liam arrives once in a while in polished shoes and a scent that costs more than my first toolbox. He talks easily the way some men practice in front of mirrors about legacy planning and intergenerational leverage and tax-smart distribution frameworks. The words slide across a table like coasters under sweating glasses. In a town that still quotes cattle prices at dinner, he's a shiny object and people here like shiny until it blinds them. On a local podcast, he's a minor celebrity. Folks repeat his phrases at Rotary as if repetition can turn strategy into character. I nod and pour him tea the way I would to any guest. I don't hand the reins to a man because his grin photographs well. Around here, the hardware store keeps a running tab for half the county, and the garage has a couch that swallows tired backs. You buy brisket from the place that doesn't need a menu, and you learn to wave at people from the wheel without taking your eyes off the road. Safety is mostly a contract we sign with one another. Show up, be decent, tell the truth when it counts. The deputies know which porches hold widowers who'll pretend they don't need help. The teenagers practice their rock bands in outbuildings and dream of Austin. All of it hums along, a low and steady current. My hands sometimes tremble the way old hands often do when they lift the wrong-shaped glass, but it's a nuisance, not a verdict. I manage it with common sense, smaller mugs, slower movements, lists I check twice. The clinic keeps me honest with numbers that say I'm fit enough to work and stubborn enough to ignore advice I don't respect. Pills line up in a plastic tray like little soldiers. I salute them at breakfast and carry on. Control what you can, label the rest. Don't borrow trouble. In the evenings, I sit on the porch and listen to the barrels breathe. Wood expands and contracts in tiny prayers. Coyotes throw their gossip down the draw. If Emily is coming the next day, I thaw sausage. If church is near, I iron a shirt. These are small vows to myself, the ordinary liturgy of later life. Habit keeps the wolves on their side of the fence. I believe the arrangements I'd built, machines that remembered for me, logs that dated what I might forget, neighbors who knew where I kept my spare key, were enough to keep the peace I'd earned. I believed the evidence would be on my side if I ever needed it. What I did not believe and could not yet imagine was how quickly a man with charm and a microphone could turn concern into leverage, and leverage into a plan with my name on it. The doorbell, the cameras, the measured rows of barrels, my pencil stub notes, these would matter soon in ways I hadn't intended. For now, the evening light slid off the porch rail and I closed the logbook on a day that looked like any other. I thought routine had me covered. I was wrong. If you're still watching and finding this story gripping, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. Evenings on my place arrive like something poured, slow and amber, catching edges before they disappear. I closed the rickhouse ledger, slipped the pencil behind my ear, and stood listening to the soft tick of cooling tin. The porch light threw its dependable circle against the dark, and the wind came up dry from the pasture, combing the Johnson grass and rattling the tag on the gate. I like evenings because they ask nothing of you except to keep faith with small routines. Lock the shop, backflush the hose, make sure the timer on the dehumidifier will behave until morning. I set the kettle, pulled down a chipped mug, and watched steam ghost the window where the last of the sun was trying to remember us. The phone rang while the kettle sang. Liam's name bloomed on the screen in the neat font that makes even trouble look tidy. His voice came warm as a salesman's handshake. He said he'd been thinking about simplifying paperwork for my sake and for Emily's. "I've got clean, tax-smart templates for power of attorney and medical directives," he said. "We can streamline things." I told him evenly that Rosa had drawn up my documents years ago and reviewed them last fall. "All set," I said. "Appreciate the thought." He chuckled, said, "Of course, just trying to help," and let the call fade like a man who knows how to leave a door propped. Afterward, I stood there with my hands on the counter, feeling the old house listen back. I have a rule: be grateful for offers. Be guided by proof. Still, an unease put a finger on my spine. I rinsed the mug, wiped the ring of coffee, and told myself the proper answer to worry at my age is inventory. I checked the firebox, checked the barrel room latch, Check the doorbell clip out of habit more than suspicion, which is when the porch light bloomed for real and the camera showed Liam. He came up the 3 steps fast, angling his face away from the lens the way folks do when they believe the house is empty. He leaned close to his phone, close enough that the mic caught the paper-dry whisper of his collar. "He's old," he said to whoever was on the other end, impatience nipping at the words. "Just get him to sign." He tugged his cuff, looked up and down the drive, then backed off the porch like a man exiting a stage he never meant to be seen on. I didn't walk to the door. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened the doorbell app, and saved the clip. Metadata first. Timestamp, device, location, strength of the Wi-Fi, ambient audio. I made a duplicate to an SD card and labeled it in my small, steady print. Front door, visitor 2113. Then I put on a jacket and walked the fence line with a flashlight because movement is how I talk to myself when words threaten to get in the way. There is a special kind of insult in being addressed as a problem to be managed. I had to be careful not to personalize it. The world is full of men who think patience is a form of surrender. It's not. A week later, past dusk, I took the farm road toward town for feed. FM 473 was empty enough that the night seemed to own it. A pickup slid in behind me near the county line, high beams throwing a hot square into the cab and a white headache across the dash. It held there, too close. When I slowed at a dip, it floated with me. The old muscles remembered job sites where backing a truck an inch too far could tear a man from what he loved, and my shoulders tightened. I signaled early and pulled into the gas station by the closed cafe. The pickup followed, idled at the far pump, then drifted on casual as a yawn. I sat until my breathing quit making decisions. The dash cam had been running. Back home, I pulled the card, marked the time, and filed a note on a yellow pad. Roadtail, FM 473, 2206, white pickup, aux lights. The box from the courier arrived the next evening. Thick envelope, signature required, return address from a firm I didn't recognize but which sounded like a law office that had married a hedge fund. Inside, neat tabs, color-coded instructions, and a letter that sweet-talked urgency in the bureaucratic voice of concern. The language was practiced, for your protection, for convenience, for your family. It asked for my signature in 4 places and suggested Emily keep the originals for ease of administration. The signature block already contained something that looked very much like my name, nearly perfect, except the loop on the Y leaned a degree too far west, and the D carried a pressure my hand never uses. I placed it beside my bank card signature under the desk lamp. The differences were the kind only a man who has signed his name in job site wind would feel, but they were there. I did not call Liam. I did not call Emily. I set the papers back in the envelope, sealed that inside another with my own note, and wrote across the seam in block letters, received unexecuted, date, time. Then I took pictures of the package circled by my wristwatch so the hands told a story the numbers could corroborate, and I sent Rosa a message asking for the first morning she had. On the door of the safe, I taped a small list of where the copies now lived. If you must be suspicious, be thorough. Before bed, I cupped my hands around a glass of water and watched the surface shim as my fingers trembled a little. No more than usual, no more than coffee and age allot me. It's a nuisance, this shake, the way a loose porch board is a nuisance. You notice it when you step wrong. But nuisances make convenient stories for people who need motives, and I could imagine how a man who wanted leverage might reach for the word decline and see where it carried. I set the glass down and wrote one more note for myself. Don't argue with wind, build a wall. I texted Emily a simple line, come Sunday if you can, I'll make sausage and biscuits, and left it at that. She doesn't need my storms. Sheriff Tate could get an earful on Saturday between cast and reel if I still felt the need to say the things I hadn't said tonight. I walked to the rooms once more, touching the familiar, cool enamel of the sink, the nicked edge of the butcher block, the frame of Maggie's photograph, because a man has to anchor himself to what is before he can face whatever he suspects might be coming. I believed in the quiet contract I'd made with proof. Save the clip, log the mile, seal the envelope. Tomorrow, I told myself, we would verify and verify again, and it would amount to nothing more than sweat spent on a false alarm. But a few days later, while I sorted invoices at the kitchen table, Rosa called with a voice that made the room smaller. There was a filing at the courthouse, a challenge to my estate, and attached to it, a supplemental will I had supposedly executed. The kettle clicked off behind me. I didn't reach for the cup, I reached for the logbook. Evidence first, always, then breath, then battle. If you're still here and the twists are pulling you in, comment number 2 below so I know you're following along. Let's dive into Chapter 3. Monday broke clear and mean, the kind of blue that leaves no place to hide. I was matching receipts to ledger entries at the kitchen table when Rosa called. Her voice carried the clipped calm of a woman who keeps other people's storms in labeled jars. She said a petition had been filed at the county courthouse challenging my estate, attaching a supplemental will and a fresh set of financial and medical powers of attorney that placed the majority of assets inside a family trust with Liam as trustee. They're asserting diminished capacity, she added. Paper can bruise more quietly than fists. I wrote the case number in my logbook, underlined the date, and asked for certified copies. She promised scans by noon and told me to breathe. The documents arrived with that bureaucratic odor, confident language, and a desire to be obeyed. I read every line. The trust instrument gave broad powers to liquidate and reallocate holdings for the family's benefit, naming accounts I had never intended to bundle. A clause threatened to disinherit me from my own plan if I contested. The vocabulary felt rented, as if the person who wanted my signature had borrowed a suit 2 sizes too large. It used the word stewardship like a brand and legacy like a coupon. While I was still reading, my phone chimed with a link. A local podcast had dropped a new episode. Liam, in a low studio voice, spinning a story about a father-in-law slowing down, about the tenderness of planning ahead. He said the words safety and clarity and compassionate oversight until they were smooth as river stones. He never used my name. He didn't have to. In the comments, acquaintances typed their sympathies to Emily and their admiration for the kind of son-in-law who looks out for family. A few mentioned that I sometimes mixed up dates at the feed store. People love a narrative that offers both mercy and permission. While I was still reading, my phone chimed with a link. A local podcast had dropped a new episode. Liam, in a low studio voice, spinning a story about a father-in-law slowing down, about the tenderness of planning ahead. He said the words safety and clarity and compassionate oversight until they were smooth as river stones. He never used my name. He didn't have to. In the comments, acquaintances typed their sympathies to Emily and their admiration for the kind of son-in-law who looks out for family. A few mentioned that I sometimes mixed up dates at the feed store. People love a narrative that offers both mercy and permission. Emily texted from between client meetings, and I could hear the hurry in her punctuation. Please don't stress. He just wants to make it easier. Later, I stared at the screen and remembered her as a child, smoothing crayon paper so the edges wouldn't curl. I told her we would talk when I had the full picture, that I was fine, that I loved her. I did not ask where she stood. You don't drag your children into the ditch to prove you can still climb out. Rosa flagged the notary on the filings, Marina Ortiz. The name rang no bell. I pictured the 3 neat signatures beside mine, date, seal, flourish, and the blank where memory should have lived. I called Sheriff Tate for a soft touch of background. He sighed long enough to empty a coffee cup and said he'd heard Marina had debts with a Parker cousin. Nothing official, he warned. Just the kind of unofficial that turns into official if you push. I wrote down the rumor and put a box around it. Rumors don't make cases, but they point at where cases might be hiding. I asked Noah Kim to swing by that afternoon. He's the kind of young man who treats data like livestock. Feed it right, don't spook it, know where it sleeps. We sat at my table with the porch camera clip from the other night and went to work like mechanics around a stubborn engine. He pulled copies to 2 external drives and a fresh SD card, generated hashes, printed them alongside time and device details, and had me initial the chain of custody form he'd brought in a plastic sleeve. Then he leaned in, curious. You want to hear what the low end is hiding? He isolated the band where the doorbell's little mic stores rumble and breath, ran a gentle filter, and brought up the volume as if he were rescuing a whisper from a well. Liam's voice arrived first, recognizable in its practiced patience. A woman answered, close enough to sound complicit. Noah rolled it back, cleared one more hiss, and the line stood naked on my kitchen speakers. Push the compassionate angle. Say Parkinson's. The word strung a wire between my ribs and the table. I do not have Parkinson's. I have an old man's shake and a long memory. But the sentence had the neatness of a prepared alibi. It told me I wasn't simply being handled. I was being scripted. Anger is a generous fuel and a terrible map. I let it flare, then poured it into lists. First, request the full notary log and Marina's record of where the signing supposedly happened. Second, pull the podcast audio, date stamp it, and transcribe the parts where Liam introduced notions of decline. Third, schedule an independent cognitive evaluation with a physician Rosa trusts, not anyone whose business card sits in Liam's desk. Fourth, inventory my accounts and revoke shared online access I had once given out of convenience. Fifth, make a quiet appointment with the sheriff to memorialize the white pickup that pressed me on FM 473. Facts before feelings, witnesses before accusations. Noah and I built an evidence index the way I used to set up schedules on bridge pours. We labeled the porch clip VR01, the enhanced audio AU01, the dashcam footage DC01, the courier envelope DOC01, and the podcast RIP MEDIA01. For each, we recorded the file path, physical storage location, hash, and who had custody. We took photos of seals and signatures, printed them, and I signed the page margins in the spot where forgers forget to practice. He nodded, satisfied, and told me to store OneDrive off-site. I put it in the safe with Maggie's ribbon and locked the dial with a care I reserve for things I can't afford to lose. I wanted to call Liam and ask him whether compassion feels different when you weaponize it, but I did not. Southern manners are not just white gloves, they are bridle and bit. I would not give him a recording of my temper. Nor would I ask Emily to referee a fight she didn't start. My body knew the cost of fury, tight shoulders, shallow breath, the kind of fatigue that lets grief slip its leash. Better to answer the insult with evidence and let the room hear itself. Toward evening, I stood in the rickhouse with my palm on a barrel and listened to wood do what it was made to do, expand just enough to hold what it must. I have believed all my life in the strength of structures that honor their materials. A man is a kind of structure. So is a plan. If someone was going to put their hands on the beams of my house, I intended to be there with a level and a rule. I called Rosa and asked her to book the cognitive exam and start the paperwork to contest. "We'll move quickly," she said. "We'll move correctly," I answered. We set times. We assigned tasks. I added a note to meet Mason on Saturday for an incident report. Then I closed the logbook on a day that had used up more steadiness than most and left the porch light burning a little longer than usual. Tomorrow would belong to doctors and forms and the quiet arithmetic of defense. The fight had begun whether I admitted it aloud or not, and I meant to meet it with the only weapon that never embarrasses a man, proof. If this chapter hit you hard and kept you watching, drop a number 3 in the comments so I know you're staying with me. Now let's continue with Chapter 4. I woke before the alarm, the kind of waking that feels like being called to the job site in rain. Coffee first, then the kitchen table became a staging deck. I cleared crumbs with the side of my hand, laid out folders like beams, labeled each spine with a black felt tip. VR01, AU01, DC01, DOC01, MEDIA01. Fresh envelopes waited open like mouths. I wrote the day and hour in my logbook and underlined the words I keep close when pride wants the wheel. Facts before feelings. Rosa had set the appointment with a county physician who doesn't owe Liam a Christmas card. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and recent mopping. I sat in a bright room where the clock was the only art, answering questions I have asked other men at the veterans' breakfast when they seemed untethered. The doctor read numbers, I repeated them backward. He asked for a clock face. I drew a circle, placed 12 and 6, then wrote the hour and minute hands with the steadiness that returns when I care about where the line lands. He had me name animals, subtract sevens, remember a phrase, and fetch it back 10 minutes later as if it were a tool left on a sawhorse. He did not rush. When we finished, he tapped notes into a tablet and printed a summary. "No cognitive impairment observed," he said, voice even. I folded the paper once, then once again, and slid it into a sleeve labeled EVAL01. From there, I drove to the church. Pastor Wells keeps his office tidy in a way that invites conversation but not confession. He listened while I described routines as if they were liturgy. Classes I teach for the older men about budgets and scams, the tasting tours at the Rick House where I list mash bills without checking a card, the ledger I can quote by page because I wrote it by hand. He drafted a statement in his neat print, citing dates and examples. "I'll swear to this if asked," he said, and placed a careful signature at the bottom. I thanked him, and he squeezed my shoulder with a gentleness that made a noise in my throat. AFF01 went behind EVAL01, tabs aligned like shingles. At the sheriff's office, fluorescent lights hummed impatiently. Mason met me by the counter and led me to a desk where the veneer has remained loyal despite decades of elbows. I told him about the white pickup on FM 473, the heat of its lamps in my mirrors, how it shadowed my turn and then glided off when I chose the gas station instead of the dark. He took the dashcam copy, logged the card by number, and slid over a form. I wrote the time from memory and cross-checked with my yellow pad to be precise. Mason nodded. "We'll pull highway camera footage and ping plate readers," he said. I kept my voice level. "I don't want a parade, just the record." He tipped his chin. "Records start the parades." IR01 joined the growing bundle. Back home, I tightened the perimeter the way you do before a storm. Passwords changed, recovery emails rerouted, two-factor switched from later to now, any shared access that had seemed convenient in calmer seasons revoked without apology. I shut down the accounting server and wrote with a pencil on the cover, "Offline until further notice." The shop felt quieter, as if the machines understood secrecy. Inside the safe, I rechecked the external drives. One for home, one for off-site with Noah, one to travel if the house ever took ill. Rosa filed formal demands on the notary. The log for the day she claims to have witnessed my hand, location of the signing, any audio or photographs, and the GPS history of the device she used. We did not call Marina. We did not call anyone. We pulled thread without announcing the sweater. Noah arrived with a backpack full of cables and the sort of patience that makes electronics confess. He captured the podcast episode in full quality, printed a transcript with time codes, and rounded up screenshots of comments that turned my shaky coffee pour into a diagnosis. Each image bore a URL and a minute stamp. He added entries to the evidence index like a quartermaster, Media 01 for the episode, Media 01A for the transcript, Media 01B through D for the screenshots. I initialed each line. He read the hashes aloud while I checked them. Evidence is a language. Saying it out loud makes it stay. We slid the clinic summary into its own envelope and sealed it with clear tape. I signed across the seam, then took a photograph of the signature with the afternoon light catching the fibers. AFF01 got the same treatment, then IR01. By supper, the index looked like a small bridge plan, columns of figures, cross-braced by names, loads carried here, forces traveling there, a structure fit for weather. Rosa emailed drafts for the court, a challenge to the so-called supplemental will, and a request for a temporary restraining order to keep Liam's hands off what he insists belongs to the family. I printed and read them on paper because that is how I hear mistakes. A date needed tightening. A sentence wanted the muscle of a specific. The term grandchild trust required a note that none existed. I marked in pencil squares around facts, asterisks for exhibits, and sent back scans with a short line. "Accurate to my knowledge," she replied within minutes. "Filed by close of business." I texted Emily about Sunday supper and left the subject of courts and clinics alone. She answered with a heart and a promise to bring salad. Leaving her out felt like locking a door with her on the porch, but there are storms a father shields his child from even when she's grown and carries a storm of her own. I would give her the room to decide later with facts laid out clean, not ask her to pick sides in a fog. By evening, the house had that end-of-shift quiet I remember from job trailers when the crew had gone and the drawings lay rolled like sleeping snakes. I stacked the folders by order of battle, slid them into the safe, and turned the dial with the same patience I used to test a stave's flex. The rickhouse breathed behind the kitchen wall, the heater clicked and steadied. I stood on the porch and listened to a night that was still mine. When I came back in, the email from Rosa was waiting. The court had set a temporary hearing, quick as a gavel can fall. Date, time, courtroom number, judge. I wrote them into the logbook with a new pencil point. The campaign of feeling had placed its posters across town. The room ahead would trade posters for proof. I closed the book, shut off the light, and let the house hold me the way oak holds whiskey. Tight enough to keep the shape, loose enough to breathe. If you're still hooked by what's unfolding, type number 4 in the comments to let me know you're following closely. Next, we'll head into Chapter 5. The county courtroom had the tired dignity of a church basement, dark wood, fluorescent hum, the faint mineral smell of copier toner and old paper. I sat beside Rosa at the defense table, hands folded over a yellow pencil, the way you fold hands when you need them to behave. Across the aisle, Liam leaned toward his attorney, a man with a tie loud enough to pass for confidence. Liam looked rested, practiced, the kind of calm you get from telling the same story into microphones until it feels like weather. Judge Colby took the bench with a briskness that made the room sit up. His robe carried creases like a map. He asked if counsel were ready. Liam's lawyer stood, outlined the petition, and slid exhibits to the bailiff with the ceremony of a waiter laying silver. The supplemental will went first, thick, tabbed, purposeful, then durable and medical powers of attorney that expanded like shade. He spoke of diminished capacity in a tone meant to sound regretful and offered references. A video clip of me losing a plastic cup at the fair, a neighbor's post about how I'd asked what day the trash ran. Patterns, he said, letting the word hover. He turned toward me as if to warm his hands. Mr. Caldwell, would you agree that... Rosa rose. Objection, foundation. The judge nodded. Sustained. Ask questions of witnesses, counsel. My pencil stayed on the table. I have seen job sites go bad when the first man to shout wins the day. This wasn't that day. Rosa's face settled into the expression I'd come to trust. Kindness sewn tight to steel. She introduced EV-AL01, the Independent Cognitive Evaluation, history, tests administered, findings. The doctor's summary was plain. No cognitive impairment observed. She offered AFF01, Pastor Wells's sworn statement describing my weekly classes on budgeting and fraud prevention, the brewery tours where I recited MASH bills without looking, the way I answered questions with answers instead of riddles. Everyday tremor, she said, is not legal incapacity. Colby read quickly, lips shaping the line that mattered. Then Rosa pivoted to how things are supposed to be done when you turn a person's signature into law. We request the notary log, the location, any audio or image of the signing, and the device location data for Ms. Marina Ortiz on the date claimed. She asked me to confirm whether I had ever met Marina. No, I said. The word felt like a gate clicking. She left it there. Not accusing, just letting absence stand where presence had been promised. Evidence about presence arrived next. Mason's office had sent a preliminary location report from a cell phone ping. At the hour Marina swore she stood with me and a pen, her device, if she had it, was 60 miles away at a family event. Rosa didn't say, liar. She said inconsistency, and placed IR01 on the stack. Somewhere behind me a chair creaked the way an animal does when it wants out. We moved to the porch. Noah had set the chain of custody with the devotion of a man who understands that facts can skitter unless you cup them. Rosa introduced VR01, the doorbell video, and AU01, the enhanced low-frequency audio. She stated the hash values and dates as if reading scripture, then pressed play. Liam's face filled the frame, then tipped away. His collar whispered against the mic. The enhanced band carried his voice and another, a woman's, from the phone at his ear. The sentence rose into the room like a plane lifting off a runway. Push the compassionate angle. Say Parkinson's. Rosa didn't look at me. She looked at the judge. This was recorded prior to the courier's package that arrived with powers of attorney. Liam's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we request a brief recess to review this late submitted media. Colby checked the clock and didn't smile. Denied. We'll proceed. It was then that the court clerk, young, pale, fighting nerves, approached the bench with a sealed manila envelope. She whispered to the judge, who opened it, frowned at what he saw, and motioned both counsel forward. We could not hear the words, but paper passed from hand to hand, and gravity added a few pounds to the morning. The judge returned to the microphone. An anonymous submission has been delivered. It includes screenshots of a conversation between Ms. Ortiz and a user identified as Q. Parker. The message reads, quote, "Job done, delete the log," end quote. He let the syllables sit. This is not authenticated. I will not treat it as proven. I will, however, permit it to be marked for possible verification. Liam's lawyer tried again. Recess, Your Honor. The judge shook his head. No. Continue. The room's temperature changed without the thermostat's help. What had started as a sermon about kindness now felt like a deposition taken in a storm. Rosa gathered the points as a contractor might gather bids. We have, first, a physician's report showing intact cognition. Second, sworn community testimony about daily function and financial instruction. Third, significant questions regarding the propriety of the notarization and the notary's physical presence. Fourth, evidence of a coordinated public narrative that mischaracterizes ordinary tremor as incapacity and, per the recording, instructs its own script. On that basis, we request a temporary restraining order preventing Mr. Parker from accessing or altering Mr. Caldwell's accounts and a preservation order for all devices and logs in the notary's possession. The judge looked down the room's middle like a surveyor sighting a line. Mr. Parker's counsel? There was hemming, there were objections that sounded tired when they were born. He overruled what needed overruling and noted what needed noting. I watched Liam's jaw go still, a muscle fluttering near his ear. It's a small cruelty to enjoy the moment when a man realizes the narrative he rehearsed is being graded by a different teacher. I didn't enjoy it. I felt the odd loosening that comes when fear has to make room for work. Colby announced a brief lunch recess with the promise of a prompt return. He instructed the plaintiff to be prepared to address the notary discrepancies and the screenshot's provenance after the break. He directed both parties to exchange lists of devices subject to preservation. The gavel came down like a knuckle on a door you're already walking through. We stood. The room uncoiled. Rosa leaned toward me, not to strategize but to anchor. We keep our pace, she said softly. I nodded, my shoulders remembered air. As we walked into the corridor's fluorescent cold, I let myself register the thing I'd come here to prove to other people, and apparently to myself, that patience and records, properly stacked, can turn a room. Afternoon would ask for choices, a question of how much to show and how fast. For the first time since the petition arrived, I trusted the answer would be built, not guessed. We ate in the courthouse corridor because hunger doesn't cancel court. Rosa passed me a paper-wrapped half of brisket and a napkin that looked like it had been ironed by habit. The air was refrigerated and smelled faintly of toner and wax. We can keep it narrow, she said, voice low enough not to echo, or we can show more of what we have and risk burning bridges that still matter to you. I thought of the difference between torch and lantern. A torch makes daylight and enemies. A lantern shows enough to keep your footing. I remembered Maggie telling me once when a subcontractor tried to slip extras onto a bill not to let anyone define kindness by my wallet. I wiped my hands, folded the paper into a neat square, and chose. We do it right, I said. All the way. When the bailiff called us back, the courtroom's hum resumed as if a machine had been plugged in. Colby took the bench and asked the plaintiff to address the notary discrepancies and the anonymous screenshots. Liam's counsel shuffled papers and asked to move authenticity to the end of the day. The judge said the word the room already knew: proceed. Rosa began, but before she could stack her next exhibit, Emily stood. She'd been sitting behind us, quiet as winter grass, and now she moved toward the rail with a small USB drive pinched between her fingers like a match she would only strike once. She asked to be heard as a witness to facts. Rosa's glance sought mine and found me steady. A clerk swore Emily in. I watched her breathe, then hold that breath the way a diver does before cold water. The first file came from the cabin of Liam's truck. Emily had recorded it on a day she said she could not bear to pretend the conversation was normal. Noah, who'd been waiting in the second row like a young tree, stepped forward with a laptop and verified a hash on the fly. The speakers filled with Liam's tone, the one he saves for men he wants to agree with him, and another voice I didn't recognize. The words were precise enough to feel premeditated. If we move his assets into a trust I manage, we can place them into a new fund. 2% is standard, perfectly legal. The audio did not shout. It measured. Colby allowed a clipped excerpt to be marked and played once, then ordered the entire device mirrored and preserved. Emily handed over a second drive and a printed packet, a prospectus and subscription agreement branded with Liam's office header, big promises and small disclosures, no state registration number. Rosa marked them EXHFUNDA and B and said 15 words about unregistered offerings and elder exposure. Liam's lawyer called them drafts and marketing ideas. The judge didn't decide the law that instant. He did something more immediate. He signed a preservation order for Liam's firm. Emails, cloud storage, client relationship systems, anything that could turn a draft into a memory. Rosa let silence rinse the room, then nodded to Noah. He cued a third clip, this one grainy and green, from a trail camera I had zip-tied to a T-post to catch deer that liked my sorghum. 2 weeks old. A service van idled at my north fence. A man in coveralls slid under my truck with a tool bag and came out 6 minutes later, looking both directions with the paranoia of the guilty or the paid. Noah paused on a frame where the license plate was clean. He printed the still, labeled it, and handed it to the bailiff. I submitted a copy of a repair invoice from the same week, same garage, routine service I had never requested. Rosa followed with a photocopy of a PR event consulting payment from Liam's office to the garage's owner for the identical amount paid the day before. The numbers made a line you could walk without tripping. To keep us honest, Rosa asked Sheriff Tate to confirm, only that his office had received copies of the footage and receipts as part of the incident report I'd filed earlier and that an inquiry was open. He kept his answer as lean as a statute. The point wasn't drama. The point was sequence. Contact with my vehicle before any court papers were served, money that flowed where it didn't belong, and a public narrative that tried to make my steadiness look like decline. Rosa gathered the afternoon like lumber into a tidy stack. She asked for an expanded temporary restraining order, no access by Liam to any of my accounts or property, no alterations to titling or beneficiaries, and a preservation order with teeth for every device in the orbit of this story. The notary's phones and laptops, Liam's firm's servers, anything that had carried a file or a whisper. She asked the court to note, without finding, that the fund materials might interest the state securities board. I said very little. When Emily stepped down, she glanced at me with a mixture of apology and resolve that split me open and made something stronger where it hurt. I kept my eyes on Rosa's legal pad and on the exhibits that bore my initials. To look at Liam would have been to squander a discipline I'd paid for with mornings of quiet and a life of habit. Liam's counsel objected to everything the way a man throws buckets at a grass fire. Some objections smoldered, most hissed out. Colby granted what the law and the facts could carry and refused theater. He issued the expanded TRO, ordered the immediate preservation and exchange of device lists by end of day, warned of sanctions for spoliation, and directed that a copy of the record be forwarded to the district attorney and the state securities office for whatever review they deem appropriate. He didn't say the word criminal. He didn't have to. The gavel came down with a sting that lit the room and then put it out. Conversation started in clusters. Chairs scraped, stares landed and fled. Liam had the color of an office plant left over a weekend without water, and his mouth moved with his lawyer's whisper like a bad dub. We walked out as a small unit, Rosa, Emily, and me, through air that felt newly domesticated. The corridor was still cold, but the cold no longer owned me. Outside, the light was the thin kind you get before weather shifts. Emily touched my sleeve and said, quiet enough to fall through cloth, "I'm sorry." I told her there was nothing to forgive and everything to be proud of. I did not know which would be harder in the days ahead, that the town would pick a new story to tell, that the law would begin the slow gear of consequences, or that a father and a daughter would have to learn how to speak in a house where truth had just changed the furniture. I knew only this: the room had turned, and the cost of turning would arrive next. If the tension of this choice has you leaning in, comment number 6 below so I know you're still with me. Let's push forward to Chapter 7. We stepped into the thin noon light like men leaving a foundry, heat traded for glare, noise for the hum of cicadas and traffic. Rosa pressed a copy of the expanded restraining order into my hand, the pages warm from the printer and stamped in blue. The preservation order wrote on top, a stern little sermon about devices, logs, and consequences. "Deadlines today," she said. "Device inventory by 5. I'll file ours at 3. I nodded and slipped the papers into my briefcase as if weight could anchor the day. Emails arrived before we reached the truck. The clerk confirmed that the record had been forwarded to the district attorney and the state securities office for review. The phrase carried the dryness of a warning label. Another message from the sheriff's office asked me to stop by for a brief supplemental statement and to provide clean copies of the trail cam clip and the garage receipt I'd already logged as exhibits. I wrote the time on my pad, not because I would forget, but because I like to keep promises in ink. By evening, the local station ran a careful segment, graphics in red and beige, tone sober. The podcast that once admired Liam issued a pause notice promising to temporarily remove content pending the court's direction. I didn't cheer. I made a sandwich and ate it standing at the sink, watching swallowtails work the lantana like they had a job to keep. Emily arrived just after dark with 3 boxes, the kind you use when you don't yet believe you're moving. We carried them to her old bedroom. The posters were long gone, but the window still framed the same slice of pasture and sky. We cooked eggs and ate them in the quiet way families do when words would only push bruises deeper. She rinsed the plates. I dried them. That was all. Later on the porch, she folded her hands and looked at the slope. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner," she said. I told her, "It isn't your fault," and let the silence say the rest. Rosa called with updates while the crickets tuned up. Subpoenas had gone out to Marina for her notary log, devices, and location data. Through counsel, Marina asked for time. Hallway News said money trouble and Parker Cousins had knotted her up. The sheriff left a message the next morning. The mechanic had admitted being paid cash for a quick look arranged by Avery Quinn, a freelancer sometimes used by Liam's office. No conclusions, just breadcrumbs. I let each crumb land in the ledger and refused to name the loaf. The preservation order found Liam's firm by lunch. An IT contractor began mirroring their email, cloud storage, and client system. Appointments evaporated from his public calendar. His social feeds went quiet in the precise way of a man told to stop talking by someone who can fine him if he doesn't. I did my part at home. I finished revoking residual access privileges, isolated a couple of small accounts that had been on autopilot, and moved a slice of riskier holdings into dull, reliable bonds per the schedule Rosa and my accountant had sketched months ago. The accounting computer stayed offline. I added 2 county cameras along the stretch of road that had felt most exposed and updated the map I keep of every angle that watches my fences. A house ages like a man. You maintain what you love, and you add what you need. That night, Emily and I sat under the porch light while moths threw themselves at the bulb the way hope throws itself at easy stories. She told me she'd spoken to HR about a leave and to a friend about a spare room if she needed space later. I told her the freezer inventory and the key code and where I keep the title box. "You don't have to be strong every minute," she said. "Neither do you," I answered. We let the dog from next door patrol the yard line twice before going in. Fatigue put pebbles behind my eyes. My shoulders ached with the honest work of restraint. The tremor in my fingers found the lip of a glass and made itself known. I set the glass down, wrote a line in the logbook, TRO served, devices listed, sheriff intake scheduled, and felt steadier for having made a mark the day could lean on. I sent Rosa a checklist of every account and key I'd touched since the hearing, then checked the seals on the evidence envelopes with the officious tenderness of a man polishing metals that only he will see. Rosa's next call came early. Depositions would begin soon, Marina first, then a representative from the garage, perhaps Quinn if service was achieved. She would file a motion challenging the supplemental will's validity on notarization defects alone. "We stay procedural," she said. "Let them argue Storie. We'll argue spine." I agreed, and the agreement felt like the click of a seatbelt before a long grade. Around town, the sound shifted. The hardware man who'd once clapped Liam on the back kept his greeting neutral and slipped a loaf of church bread into my bag by accident. A neighbor left a pie on the porch rail with no note, the old apology of rural Texas. I didn't measure sentiment, I measured behavior. At dusk, I stood beside the rickhouse with my palm on a warm barrel, listening to wood and whiskey negotiate their slow truce. The day had spent me, but it hadn't emptied me. Somewhere between the breath of oak and the rasp of cicadas, I understood that storms can cleanse as well as break. The orders would harden into process. Investigations would grind. Family would relearn its shape. Tomorrow I would start pruning. Sell a parcel that never quite belonged in the portfolio, draft a checklist for the men at church on passwords, logs, and cameras, and meet Noah to finish the data map we'd half drawn on my table. The barrels breathed. I breathed back. The wind had changed. The weather hadn't. Morning came rinsed and useful. Light slanted through the kitchen like a clean rule, catching dust in the steam that rose off my mug. The rickhouse carried a low, toasted warmth, and the barrel sounded content the way a good dog does after a long run. I pulled the legal pad closer and made 4 columns: data, money, security, family, because problems shrink when you give them boundaries. Today would not be about surviving. It would be about design. Noah arrived with a backpack that could have started a small lab. We emptied the evidence folders across the table and built a map from sources to storage. The doorbell clip and enhanced audio, the dash cam, the courier envelope, the podcast rip with time-coded transcript, the clinic summary, the pastor's affidavit, the incident report. For each, Noah wrote file name, format, hash, where it lived, and who was holding it now. Then he distilled the chain of custody steps onto one sheet. Capture, duplicate, hash, seal, photograph the seal, log the handoff. He printed it, saved a PDF, and set a calendar reminder for quarterly backups. I taped a copy inside the pantry door where recipes used to hang. Security next. We standardized passwords and rotated out anything that smelled like memory. 2 factors shifted from text messages to an authenticator app. I made a key escrow bundle, safe code, estate contacts, a slim how-to for cameras, sealed it in a labeled envelope, and wrote the date across the seam. Outside, we walked the perimeter and tuned the angles. The new county cameras covered the hollow where the pickup once hid. The barn cam got a taller mount, the porch cam a wider field. I logged serials, firmware versions, and a test clip for each. Devices behave better when they know you're watching. By late morning, Rosa and my accountant joined by video. We moved a slice of risk into dull bonds that would never make a magazine cover and would never make my stomach jump. We separated a couple of convenience accounts from auto-pay pipelines and closed one that had become a backdoor by laziness. I signed the listing papers for a parcel that didn't pull its weight. Liquidity is a friend to old men in tight fights. We ended with a clean 1-page summary of holdings I could hand to a judge without apology. Rosa laid out the immediate legal spine: depose Marina, haul the garage's representative, and if service landed, put Avery under oath. She would press the motion challenging the supplemental will on notarization defects alone. I assembled a carry kit, printed exhibits, mirrored USB, a checklist with a blank for each signature and timestamp, and slid it into a messenger bag that once held blueprints. The afternoon belonged to the church. I drafted the first version of the Elder Proof Kit, 2 pages of the kind of boring that saves lives, password basics, who to call, where to anchor cameras and how to aim microphones, what counts as a lawful recording in Texas, how to seal an envelope so chain of custody can breathe in court, a tiny event log with boxes for time, device, and witness. I added a paragraph about the difference between suspicion and paranoia and left 3 lines at the bottom for notes. Pastor confirmed Saturday after breakfast for a short talk. I ran the handouts on the copier and felt the odd buoyancy that arrives when you build something other people can use. At the sheriff's office, I delivered a paired packet, only what the investigation required, and sketched the camera plan for our road in pencil on a county map. We spoke in nouns: install, review, preserve. I did not ask for news. He did not give any. The work itself was a comfort. I tightened the circle of trust at home. Anyone who touched the xylophone of my data would sign a plain language confidentiality sheet. Scope, timeline, compensation, exit. I deleted 3 handy logins I'd given friends in easier seasons and felt 20 pounds lighter without them. Convenience will sell you out if you let it. That evening, Emily and I ate bean chili at the table without ceremony. I told her what she needed to know: where the escrow envelope lived, who to call if my phone didn't answer, and kept the rest folded. She said she had a friend with a spare room if space became wisdom. I told her the porch light stays on and left it there. After dishes, I walked the fence line. Heart even, breath easy, the trimmer quieted to an afterthought. Back at the counter, I wrote a single line: structure calms the storm. The town sent its quiet signals. An extra $1 knocked off a hardware bill, a lemon pie with no note. And I logged behavior instead of sentiment. In the rick house, Oak and Whiskey continued their patient negotiation. I touched a barrel head and felt answers in the grain. Rosa's text landed just after 9. The file had reached the grand jury and the securities office, and the court had set the next hearing. Dates, times, room number, I copied them into the logbook, sharpened a pencil, and closed the cover on the day the evidence would speak in its turn. My job was to keep it safe and keep breathing. If you're still here and the search for resolution has you intrigued, comment number 8 in the comments so I know you haven't left me. Now we move into Chapter 9. The call came just after sunrise while I was walking the rick house, palm on a barrel as if I could hear time through Oak. Rosa's voice was crisp, carrying pages I hadn't seen. The grand jury had returned indictments: Marina on falsified notarization, the mechanic on tampering with a vehicle. Referrals to the district attorney and the state securities board were moving. "No fireworks," she said, "just process." I wrote the date in my logbook and underlined it once. The wood breathed under my hand, steady as a metronome. Before we could sharpen exhibits for the next civil hearing, Liam's lawyer filed a notice withdrawing every pleading that sought control over my estate. The language was polished and evasive, to focus on family and business priorities, and read like a towel thrown from a safe distance. Rosa confirmed receipt and kept her pen ready for fees if the judge wanted to talk about costs. Retreat is still a motion worth writing down. Court that afternoon was short, as if the building wanted its air back. Judge Colby reviewed the file, clipped a paper to order, and spoke without ornament. The original will stands. The supplemental instruments are void for defects in execution and lack of foundation. The temporary restraints become a standing order barring interference with my accounts and property. The gavel fell softly and did not need to repeat itself. People stirred as if waking from a nap they hadn't meant to take. Process kept walking. The clerk's minute entry showed transmissions to prosecutors and regulators. I did not squint at the path beyond that line. Publicly, Liam went quiet. His firm's calendar thinned. Marina's counsel signaled cooperation. The mechanic pled out early, a man eager to trade confession for smaller numbers. I did not chase the news. I dusted shelves and checked seals. At home, the financial plan I'd sketched with Rosa and my accountant took its last shape. The parcel that never fit the portfolio closed. Funds settled into bonds that will never boast. Convenience accounts stayed separated and small. I printed a one-page summary that even a hostile room would understand and tucked it behind the safe door with the title box. Then I drove to the credit union and signed papers that opened a scholarship fund for trade apprentices, something I'd promised Maggie and then postponed for years. The clerk asked what to name it. I said the town's name first, then hers. The receipt looked better than any trophy. Emily decided to return to Austin for a time. We packed her boxes in the quiet rhythm families know when goodbyes are only for a season. I drove the hill road slow, a hum under the tires and the radio low to a song Maggie loved, a steel guitar keeping company with distance. At her building, we carried everything up without talking strategy. At the curb, she squeezed my arm. "Porch light?" she asked. "Always," I said. It was most of a conversation and enough of a vow. Around town, humility replaced opinion. The hardware man's handshake landed like an apology and a welcome. The podcaster who'd once praised Liam posted a correction, removed the old episode, and learned how red ink looks on a screen. At church, the older men took my elder proof kit with the wary gratitude of people who have learned the difference between privacy and isolation. Noah came over for chicken and potatoes and a toast with the cheap bourbon I used to season oak. We didn't talk about victories, we talked about backups. Mason stopped by later and took a jar of pickles from my fridge with the authority of friendship. We played 2 hands of dominoes and let the third go. That evening, I pinned Maggie's small flag lapel pin to my jacket and stood in front of her photograph. Grief did not leave, it moved its chair. I wrote a line beneath the day's entries. Evidence speaks, I listen, and closed the book. The page felt heavier than it looked, like concrete that knows the footings below are good. I walked the fence at dusk and counted camera lights blinking like patient eyes. The gate hinges didn't squeal. The porch flooded its clean circle onto the steps. Peace didn't feel like luck. It felt like a structure. Posts set deep, plumb lines trued, lines tightened, so the wire sings but doesn't break. I had paid in patience, in notes taken when anger wanted to talk, in the small discipline of saving what a thing says about itself. Rosa texted late with 2 tidy appointments, a final review to close the civil file, and the church breakfast where I'd promised to talk about logs and locks and the way a signature can be both a covenant and a trap. Pastor confirmed the room. I sharpened a pencil and left it on the table beside the handouts. The house settled on its foundations. Tomorrow we would teach because the best use of a story you survive is to turn it into a map someone else can carry without getting lost. The church fellowship hall smelled like coffee that remembers yesterday. Folding chairs faced a portable screen. Pastor Wells kept the introduction short. "Henry's got something useful," and stepped aside. The room held faces I knew, veterans who count pills by the week, widows who carry appointment cards like prayer beads, the hardware man with sawdust in the crease of his wrist, 2 teenagers flanking their mother in quiet protection. I set my notes down and let my voice find the slow, workable rhythm of a shop talk. I did not retell the case. I traced the spine. Suspicion had knocked. Devices heard, logs remembered. A courtroom listened because proof brought its own oxygen. 4 steps, I said, and pointed to the screen as if we were framing a wall. Record what you see and hear. Back it up in 2 places. Seal it so your future self can swear where it's been. Write it down. Time, place, device, witness. None of it heroic, all of it durable. A few pens moved, a few heads did too. Kindness got its own section. We grew up in a county where you lend your truck and your last Saturday. Keep that, but do not confuse generosity with surrender. Passwords are not hospitality. Powers of attorney are not apologies to people who talk faster than you. Kindness isn't a power of attorney, I said. A few smiles broke, rueful as old boots. I told them how convenience had tempted me, how I had trimmed it back like a hedge that wants to own the porch. Structure, I said, is how storms lose their teeth. In the rick house, the wood swells and eases, and straps do their quiet work. I measure humidity because whiskey doesn't care about feelings. In the rest of life, the equivalents are calendars, camera maps, contact lists. Put checkups on paper, draw the angle of every lens you own, and mark the dead ground. Write down who holds your keys, literal and digital. If you can't name them without looking, the list is already too long. We practiced. I handed out little log sheets, the kind with boxes that make action harder to avoid. We sealed a demo envelope together, signing across the seam so a photograph would tell a future judge that hands had not wandered. We built a list of 5 devices to back up each quarter: phone, doorbell, dash cam, desktop, router settings. I passed the USB around. If yours doesn't talk to a computer, I said, bring your grandson or bring it to me after church. We'll make it speak. I saw Emily in the back row, elbows on knees, eyes steady. When our gazes met, we exchanged a nod that carried more than it said. The porch light in that nod, the long drive to Austin, the way we had learned to leave space around the hard parts, there it was, compressed into a breath and returned. The room answered in small ways that felt large. The hardware man promised a senior's discount on entry-level cameras and the time to mount them right. A veteran asked for a monthly queue, and a pastor gave us a Saturday slot without looking at his calendar. A widow raised her hand not to speak, but to show a notebook already half filled. We stacked the handouts again, lighter this time. I closed with the only summary that made sense to a county raised on work. Justice does not love or hate you. It listens. Give it something worth hearing, evidence kept clean by discipline. Love is not weak, it needs a fence so it can graze and grow. Do 3 things this week, I said. Change a password you've been meaning to. Write a contact list with 2 backups. Print a log sheet and put it where you'll trip over it. If you do nothing else, do that. Afternoon leaned into evening by the time I pulled into the drive. I walked the fence once and watched the cameras wink their little confirmations. The gate swung without complaint. In the rick house, the barrels breathed like sleeping animals. I put my palm against one head and felt the soft push of air the bung will sometimes give if you've done the math right. Back in the kitchen, I wrote one line in the book. Tomorrow, we teach again. I left the pencils arranged and the handouts squared for the next time someone needed them. Then I turned off the kitchen light and stood a moment in the porch's warm circle. The bulb hummed. Moths stitched their frantic embroidery against the glass. Beyond it, the road kept its silence. I locked the door and the house settled on its footings, deep and true. The porch light stayed on. Eustace rarely arrives with fanfare. It comes quietly on the back of small disciplines, notes taken when anger wanted a speech, timestamps where rumor preferred a shrug, a signature made only when the hand and the mind were equally steady. In the end, loud stories surrendered to simple facts. That is the ordinary miracle of evidence. It does not shout, it accumulates. Forgiveness and boundaries can live in the same house. Kindness is not the same thing as surrender, and love does not require the abdication of judgment. We learn, sometimes the hard way, that compassion without fences invites wolves, and suspicion without proof corrodes the soul. The narrow path is to hold a tender heart and a disciplined record, to keep the porch light on without leaving the door unlocked. There is a craft to living that looks a lot like good carpentry. Square the corners, check the level, tighten the line until it sings but does not snap. Build a structure you can trust when weather changes, routines that steady the hands, tools that remember when memory is tired, allies who tell you the truth when stories try to buy them. Peace is not luck, it is architecture, raised day by people who choose duty over drama. In that light, victory is smaller and purer than the word suggests. It is the return of ordinary freedoms. Eating in a quiet kitchen, walking a familiar fence, sleeping without rehearsing battles that have already been fought. It is knowing that integrity outlives performance, and that patience, while mocked, will outlast the applause for shortcuts. The lesson is humbling and hopeful. When we anchor ourselves to what is verifiable, we become harder to move. If this story left you with anything, let it be a map. Record what matters, back it up, seal it, write it down. Be generous, but let your generosity travel with good judgment. Keep faith with small things. And when the next storm leans against your door, meet it with the quiet confidence of someone who has already decided who they are and how they will prove it. Thank you for watching and spending time here. I'd love to hear what part resonated with you, your own lessons, your cautions, your questions. Share your thoughts in the comments. The conversation helps others find their footing. If this kind of story speaks to you, please like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss what comes next. Your presence here matters more than any algorithm, and your voice might be the guide someone else needs tomorrow.